And we are delighted to have Joshua Hammer back with us at P&P. Josh was here for his last book about 4 years ago. That one, of course, was The Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu, which told the riveting story of how an archivist in Timbuktu in northern Mali managed, with some very brave helpers, to smuggle more than 350,000 historical manuscripts out from under militant jihadists to safety about 600 miles away. The book was a bestseller and established Josh as someone for an eye for some really truly great stories. And he's done it again with his new book, The Falcon Thief, which recounts another true and gripping tale of adventure, this one about wildlife smuggling. Josh is a journalist by training and had a pretty adventurous globe-trotting run himself, working for Newsweek over nearly two decades. He joined Newsweek in the late 1980s as a business and media writer, but within a few years, he was off to cover the rest of the world on postings that based him in Nairobi, Buenos Aires, Berlin, Jerusalem, Cape Town, and back here in the U.S. in Los Angeles. For the past decade and a half, he's continued to report and travel widely, writing for a range of publications. 4 years ago, he won the National Magazine Award in Reporting for a piece titled, "My Nurses Are Dead, and I Don't Know If I'm Already Infected." That told that it was still a prize-winning story that told the story of a physician in Sierra Leone who led the effort to control the Ebola outbreak there. In addition to the Timbuktu book, Josh has written 3 other previous works, one about his younger brother who became a religious fundamentalist, another about the siege in 2002 of the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, and a third about the deadly 1923 earthquake and fire that struck Japan. It's been said of Josh that he reports like a journalist and writes like a novelist. And that's certainly the case with his work in The Falcon Thief. The book describes the exploits of Jeffrey Lendrum, a notorious wildlife smuggler who for years traveled the world stealing highly valued eggs of birds of prey and selling them to enthusiasts in the UAE, where falcons and other raptors are used for sport. The other central character in Josh's story is a detective from Britain's National Wildlife Crime Unit named Andy McWilliams, who specializes in ornithological crime solving, and was determined to catch Landrum. The book is a thrilling, fast-paced chronicle, but it's more than that. It's more than just a detective story set in a rarefied world filled with unusual characters and astounding birds. It is, as one reviewer noted, a cautionary tale about how the love of nature can go very wrong, and what happens when precious wildlife becomes a status symbol on a planet where nature is increasingly imperiled. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joshua Hammer.
Thank you. That was a great, detailed introduction. I'm humbled. Thank you. And my favorite, I think this will always be my favorite bookstore and my favorite venue to talk about these things. So thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I'm amazed that anybody goes to book events at all, so it's always impressed me. Okay, 3/4 you are my friends, so I agree. But anyway, what I have over the course of doing this particular talk now 3 or 4 times since I got to New York, the States, is to basically present a narrative without giving away the entire book, and illustrating that narrative with some pictures that I think help to bring the story to life. But I will very quickly start with an introduction about how this, because I assume most of you haven't yet seen the book, so to answer the question of how I stumbled into this thing. The Bad-Ass Librarians that came out in 2016, and that had been a story that I had followed for many years. I had beginning as an Africa bureau chief for Newsweek. I had made a couple of trips to Mali and once to Timbuktu, and then continued to visit over the years, and got a couple of Smithsonian assignments to write about the great manuscripts of Timbuktu. So I was pretty well versed in that milieu, in that story, when Al Qaeda invaded the country, and people I know actually got caught up in the violence and the capturing of the entire two-thirds of the country. So it was sort of like a story that I owned, I felt, in a way, and it made a certain amount of sense that a book would come out of it. This was something completely different. I mean, this was like an act of desperation. I mean, because I was looking for another project, and I had thrown out some just terrible ideas, including one about the 1969 Mets. I don't even want to go into them, but fortunately, then one day in 2017, I was in London with my kids, and I just happened to pick up the London Times, and was just sitting in a cafe in Hampstead reading, and there was a very short article on about page 12 or so, about this character named Jeffrey Lendrum. A headline was something like "Peregrine Thief on the Wing Again," because the tabloids love those bad puns. And this was a story about, all it said was that this guy, a notorious thief known for helicoptering and rappelling down cliffs to reach rare falcon eggs to sell to sheikhs in Dubai and in the United Arab Emirates, had vanished had been rearrested, sentenced to prison in Brazil, and had disappeared. And now the conservation world and birders around the world, wildlife police, were alarmed that he might be coming back that he might be back on the hunt. That was sort of enough to ignite my interest, and I began investigating it further and deeper, becoming as obsessed with Landrum in a way as he was about his eggs, which I think is sort of what a writer does, a journalist, nonfiction, just plunging deeper and deeper into a subject. And so with that introduction, I will tell you a bit about the story as it unfolds in the book, and try to give this some coherence, without giving too much away. This story begins in a shower room in the Emirates first and business class lounge in Birmingham International Airport in the UK, where a very vigilant janitor notices a middle-aged white fellow, a nondescript character, going into the washroom, the shower room, with all of his baggage, 3 bags, and disappears in there for 20 minutes. The janitor is waiting to clean the place. He doesn't know what's going on. Who spends 20 minutes in there? What? He's a very vigilant guy to begin with. He had a job as a security monitor, looking at closed caption, hundreds of closed caption of CCTVs in a shopping mall. So he was trained to observe. After 20 minutes, the guy comes out. The janitor goes inside the shower room, and sees that absolutely nothing has been touched. Everything is completely dry, shower unused, towels still folded, sink, bath, toilet, nothing. So he immediately suspicious. He starts rooting around, and he ends up after 5-10 minutes of looking into the ceiling tiles, whatever, underneath towels, he finds a diaper. He sees a diaper bin in the corner of the room, and he goes over to it, opens it up, sees an egg carton at the bottom of the diaper bin, otherwise empty diaper bin, with a single painted red egg, like an Easter egg, inside it, which he figures was left by the guy who was just in there. So he's completely mystified and somewhat alarmed. What could this possibly mean? He thinks it's got probably something to do with drugs. He's not sure. To make a long story short, the counterterrorism police are brought to the scene. They take him away. They strip search him. They find him beneath his T-shirt is a hospital gauze wrapped tightly around his body, and inside this hospital gauze are woolen socks, and inside the woolen socks are 14 of these which they don't know what they are. Actually, these counterterrorism police are not trained at all in understanding what they are. So they ask Jeffrey Lendrum. They by that point have looked at his passport and established his identity. is Irish national. What are these? And he tells them they're duck eggs, and they say, okay. Would you mind telling us why you are carrying, raw duck eggs attached to your body, your belly? And he explains that his chiropractor has told him that he needs to wear raw eggs wrapped around his body because it will prevent him from stooping and lead to tightening of his lower back muscles. So, okay, so at this point, they just don't know what they've got on their hands. And it's at that point that they summon Andy, make a phone call to Andy McWilliam, who is in all. If any of you have seen the reviews of this book, and there have been a few good ones. They've all been really satisfying to read, but they tend to give short shrift to Andy McWilliam, who I want to emphasize from the very beginning. This is a bad guy, good guy story. I mean, these two, you have hero and anti-hero. Jeff Lendrum being the hero. Andy McWilliam, who is the world's, you might call him, well, certainly Britain's most famous wildlife policeman with a specialty in ornithological crime. So he hears the story. He realizes it's May, breeding season. Incubating, nesting season. He realizes the guy's carrying these eggs on his body, probably not to hide them, but to keep them warm. From the description, he instantly knows that they are peregrine eggs. The eggs of the peregrine falcon. This is I actually had a better image of one, but I didn't, for some reason, didn't download. So this is just a hooded peregrine at a race. But anyway, that's basically this is a highly protected bird, a raptor, the fastest bird on the planet, can go into a stoop dive to kill another bird in midair at speeds of up to 180 miles an hour. MacWilliam knows that they are highly prized by Arab falconers in particular, especially the wealthy sheikhs of the United Arab Emirates. But he's heard rumors about this market existing, this black market, to bring in these protected raptors into the Emirates for these falconers. But here he believes, just from the very description offered to him by the counterterrorism cops, that he may have a smuggler on his hands. So MacWilliam drives down from Liverpool, where he's from. This, by the way, okay, some of this is out of order, but it doesn't matter. This is Jeffrey Lendrum. This is a portrait of him in 2010. I don't think I told you when this first incident happened. This was in May 2010. And that picture, contemporaneous. That's what he looked like back then. So MacWilliam comes down and interviews this guy, and he's still, lying and telling the same stories he told the counterterrorism police. And MacWilliam pretty quickly lets him know that he's not dealing with an idiot, that he's dealing with a wildlife expert, a raptor expert. He knows exactly what he's got. Puts Landrum on, finally gets Landrum to admit that, yes, he was stealing peregrine. They were peregrine eggs. He'd taken them, but the eggs were dead. And in fact, the eggs were dead, and he was only bringing them down to South Africa for his private collection. That was the story he gave. It didn't make, MacWilliam was pretty sure he was lying. Kept pushing. Anyway, he also admitted that he had been that he'd retrieved these eggs from cliffs in Wales. This is a picture of the Rhondda Valley, one of the greatest concentrations of peregrine falcons in the UK and possibly the world is found in this former coal mining area, noted for its cliffs, really amazing landscape, and these ledges that are sheltered from the wind. I mean, you just have howling winds up at the top of this thing. The trees were all cut down decades, even a century or more ago, because for coal mining, to basically line this incredible network of coal mines that were built over the century in this part of the UK. So this barren landscape with these fierce winds, and then these little rocky ledges here, protected from the winds, where the peregrines lay their eggs. They don't really nest. Peregrines don't really create nests. They just find these ledges and maybe put a few stones, pebbles around it to protect them from rolling off. But you have to imagine this vast landscape, huge wilderness area. I mean, and Landrum somehow was able to have acquired 14 of these peregrine eggs. So MacWilliam is pretty sure he's got a professional on his hands. So this is a trip that I took a couple of years later. I mean, 7 years later, following the footsteps of Landrum, and that's Andy McWilliam, who is as I said. Let me give you a quick background sketch of MacWilliam. So he's a Liverpool cop, working class family. Grandfather gassed in World War I. Father worked as a merchant marine. Grew up really with no options, but the police. He didn't barely finish school, but became a cop, a Liverpool cop, walking the beat, driving the beat. Became really quite well known as an investigator, and then had sort of a midlife crisis in his 40s. Decided he was tired of drug busting drug addicts and drug pushers and suicides and murders. He wanted to get away from that, and he was also a very talented rugby player, a fierce rugby player, one of the best police rugby players in England. Gave that a series of injuries, drove him to drop that. He became a bird watcher, and the bird watching that he found he absolutely loved led him into this kind of hidden, subterranean world, this black market, bird traders, killers of peregrine falcons, so like pigeon fanciers, people who love trained pigeons and kill falcons or destroy their eggs because falcons are the mortal enemy of the pigeon. Exotic bird smugglers who actually stick birds inside plastic tubes and send them, on 24-hour, horrific journeys from Thailand or the Amazon to the UK to satisfy the hunger of these rare bird fanatics, and also another odd little aspect of this is the egg collectors. This was a kind of a very British phenomenon, train spotter type guys, middle-aged men, who spend their time going off to some of the remote corners of the UK, islands north of northern Scotland, Wales, stealing eggs of rare birds, protected birds, blowing out the embryos, and then mounting them in collections, their own collections, which they have to keep secret. They usually hide them in their attics and go up there in their spare time and stare at their eggs. MacWilliam found this whole subculture that very few people knew existed, and ended up basically, pursuing these guys, hundreds of them, and almost single-handedly driving this he was involved in an operation called Operation Easter that was a major crackdown on these guys and drove them out of business. So this is his background. By the time Landrum comes across his radar screen, he's well versed he knows almost as much about rare birds, protected birds, as Landrum does. So I go here to this is the market that MacWilliam knew existed and that Landrum suddenly presented a concrete image of. This is a picture taken in Dubai. So falconry, just quickly, falconry's been around for at least 3,000 years. A lot of people believe it started in the Arab world. Bedouins started it in the desert as a way of hunting. Basically, the whole idea is you take these wild birds. In those days, there was a migration over the desert. They would trap these birds, pull them out of the sky, basically, using various stratagems, and then train them to hunt. So they started out as hunters. I mean, essentially, helping Bedouins put food on their tables. This is, we're talking even before the arrival of Islam in the Middle East. And then over the centuries, this falconry developed, and traders brought it to Europe and China and all around the world, and it became more of a sport and a recreational thing than it did a necessary way to feed yourself. But it essentially was this sort of interaction, almost mystical interaction between man and bird, in which you train a bird. Maybe some of you have read Helen Macdonald's book, so you probably know a bit about this thing. But this became, even though it spread around the world, it did kind of die out, or a lot of in the UK and Europe and the States, it never really expanded, beyond a certain group of people. In the Arab world, it became very closely identified with Arab culture, the Bedouin traditions. Even though the desert was kind of pretty much wiped or seriously eroded over the course of the last 50 years with the discovery of oil, falconry remained really intensely embedded in the culture. This is another trainer of a peregrine. and in a Dubai desert training ground. And this is the kind of passion that the wealthiest falconers, who tend to be members of the royal family, have. This is the veterinary center for for the Crown Prince of Dubai. Crown Prince Crown Prince Hamdan, sorry, the son of Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the $7 billion ruler of Dubai, who essentially built this megalopolis. This is the kind of intense. So they have these state-of-the-art hospitals where, with a staff of veterinarians from all over the world that they pay huge salaries to take care of their birds. This in the last 20 years, as the desert has gotten smaller and the natural prey of the birds has disappeared in the Persian Gulf, you have this new phenomenon called falcon racing, where the wealthy sheikhs take their birds, and even though their natural tendency is to drop in a straight drop of up, as I said, up to 160 miles an hour, they now can fly, are trained using everything from little mini airplanes and drones to handheld bait, whatever, to go horizontally, and they gather the sheikhs gather at these racetracks, falcon racetracks, and they place bets, and but in the to prepare, they have to go all over the world to find the greatest birds that will participate in these races. This is an obsession for these guys. So you have breeders basically since the 70s. You can't trade. Almost every raptor in the world has fallen under very, very severe restrictions as far as the only kind of trading of these birds, taking of these birds out of nests. Only a handful are allowed every year, and those are all, you have to have a certificate of scientific research, proving that your interest is scientific. If you're not part of the scientific crowd, you are completely forbidden from touching these birds. So to feed this great hunger for birds, there's a whole captive breeding industry that has risen up, where they take birds and they breed them in artificial environments and incubate the eggs, and a huge trade worth millions of dollars. But the Arabs, there's a certain group of Arabs, mostly these wealthy sheikhs, who believe that these captive bred birds just can't be compared to the wild ones that come out of nests. Because natural selection has bred these birds over the centuries or millennia in these wilderness environments, and these are the birds that they want. And they are willing to go to any lengths, because they're all loaded with money. They are willing to go to any lengths to hire people who will provide these birds for them, and are willing to take great risks to get them out of, because of course they only inhabit the most remote, difficult to reach places in the world. One of them was Jeffrey Lendrum. Here we go. So I became very curious to find out a little, so as did Andy McWilliams, to find out, well, what McWilliam figured immediately, or pretty quickly, that he had a global smuggler on his hands. And that if he let him go, he would escape and go back to doing this again. So MacWilliam became fixated. He had 36 hours to try to persuade a prosecutor to hold Landrum for basically carrying bird eggs on his body, which he knew, like prosecutors like those counterterrorism police, had no clue about these arcane wildlife laws that Landrum was breaking. So, it was really down to the wire trying to persuade these people this was a guy that they wanted to hold, an egg smuggler to hold on without bail. Was a difficult sell. But MacWilliam succeeded in doing it and was able to keep him without bail while he began digging into his story, as I did when I found my way to Jeffrey Lendrum's life. So Lendrum. How does one become an egg smuggler? How does one become an egg thief? What led him to the Arab world? It's such a sui generis case that it does raise the question of what in that background would have created this commerce that he engaged in. So he grew up in Bulawayo, the second city of what was then Rhodesia, and he grew up basically. His father was a third generation white African. Parents had come originally from Ireland. Great grandparents had come originally from Ireland. Landrum grew up within shouting distance of this park called Matobo National Park in what was then southern Rhodesia. Which is this kind of magnificent geological phenomenon. that has these amazing rock structures, some of which rise like thousands of feet, and then this thick vegetation that makes them absolutely perfect for raptors. So this particular park has like the greatest concentration of eagles, hawks, and falcons on the planet. And this was basically Lendrum's backyard. He became involved with his father he was born in 61, so in the late 70s he became involved in a survey, an ornithological survey of this bird. This is called the black eagle, which is one of the strongest eagles in the world, and which is found in huge concentrations at this particular park and like pretty much nowhere else in the world. So this became like Lendrum and his father went out in the field and they surveyed and they spent months just observing the nest. This is where Lendrum learned to climb trees and to rappel down cliffs. And this is just a scene of people. This is the Black Eagle survey continues even now, 50 years later. And these are some people looking at an eyrie, a Black Eagle eyrie. They lay their eggs like the falcons do, high up, 80, 100 feet, 200 feet off the ground. Very difficult to spot their nests. But this is how Lendrum grew up, getting steeped in this kind of weird stuff. This is the kind of formation that you see, and provides kind of perfect. This is just perfect kind of terrain for these creatures to thrive. Another bird this is called a crowned eagle. This is one of the rarest raptors in the world. It's known for having these giant talons and for occasionally sweeping small children off the ground and making off with them. It's been known to do that on 2 occasions in Zimbabwe that I know of. So this was Lendrum's world that he operated. Well, let me go back. And at some point in this, okay, so to sum up that story, basically Lendrum was on this ornithological surveys in the park with his father, learning to climb, learning everything about birds. And at the same time, his father led him, while they were conducting this ornithological survey and learning the locations of every nest inside the park, they were secretly taking eggs, even as a teenager, putting them in their own private collection, and at the same time, possibly, that was never verified, selling them abroad. So even as a 17 and 18-year-old, his father was kind of leading him down an ethically challenged path. As he and his father ended up being arrested for illegal possession of eggs. It's a big trial of interest, like only to birders in Rhodesia at the time. It would have been Zimbabwe at the time, the early 80s. But the consequence was that Lendrum was disgraced. He had to flee the country, ended up in South Africa, and bit by bit was led into this global enterprise back at the very beginnings in like the 90s, when the sheikhs were gearing up to get their hands on the most beautiful. The oil money was flowing, falconry was thriving, the races were about to begin, so there was a real hunger to get their hands on the most beautiful birds in the world. So Lendrum, it's kind of hard to chronicle exactly what he did on his missions, because so many of them we believe, or police believe, never came to light. But I managed to find an accomplice of his who told me, and not only did he tell me about one of these missions that they went on together, but he actually had the video to prove it. And this particular mission was to the Arctic, to Quebec, to pursue this bird, the Falcon, which is the pure white, not always pure white, but the ones that are most sought after are these pure white specimens. They're the biggest falcons in the world. The Arabs absolutely love them because they are incredibly difficult to keep alive. It's a great challenge just to keep them alive in the Middle East in a desert environment, when they're used to places like green icebergs in Greenland and the subarctic in Siberia. So there was this growing desire for falcons among these crooked Arab sheikhs. And very hard to find even commercial breeders who would provide them. So really the only way to get your hands on one would be to send somebody like Lendrum up to the far north to embark on a crazed expedition to get these things off the cliffs. So how do you do that? Well, so the accomplice told me the whole story, of which a little bit I'll give you here. This is from a video that the accomplice shot of Jeff Lendrum back in his prime. This is in 2001, and his partner, who was a Rhodesian army crony of his, who stayed in touch over the years, who became began working for the sheriff's department in a Northern California county. So he was a lawman. who Landrum enlisted to join him on this illegal egg raid up in the north. And Mullen brought along the video. These guys never imagined that one day the video would end up in the hands of the National Wildlife Crime Unit in Britain and in my hands and in a book. But this is these guys as they were given a $100,000, or Landrum was given $100,000 by a sheikh in the Middle East, who I'm not going to give that whole story away, how the connection was made. But suffice it to say that other acquaintances led him to the Arab market, and he was dispatched on the. He's total self-starter. He was the one who came up with the idea of going after the Jurs and sold it to the Arabs. And this is before they head off to a village called Kujuak, an Inuit village way up north near Hudson Bay. And this is actually the helicopter perched very near a cliff. What Landrum would do, they would spot a gerfalcon nest, sometimes a couple hundred feet above the ground or over these frozen lakes. Landrum would fasten a harness and a rope around himself. The pilot would then ascend to whatever 1,000 feet near these cliffs, and then Landrum would reach out and grab the eggs off these nests. So really just plundering this pristine environment, places that almost no one else had ever been. I mean, and Paul Mullen, who you'll meet in the book, was my chronicler of all of this, and he had the video and the plane tickets and the sound and everything to prove it. That this wasn't just he had to quickly get to that. That was a very close relationship. There was a huge fight between the two men after a couple of years after this, in which it involved Mullen's girlfriend and a complicated relationship, stealing the girlfriend, custody fights. They had a huge falling out. And Mullen was just waiting for the opportunity to sort of get even with Landrum, as he called me, karma's a bitch. And so he came forward and told MacWilliam about this, and then MacWilliam put me in touch with him, and he became this incredible source of stories for me about Landrum's life, which just stuff that had never come to light, including this incredible expedition. This is actually one of the nest sites that Mullen took a picture of as they were about to. I think that those chicks have just been hatched, so they had to time it perfectly. So you need to time it so that you arrive there when the eggs are viable, which they're not during the first 3 weeks. They're still too early, and they have to be kept at an absolutely the same temperature. Or a slight variation will kill them. At that point, even turning the egg slightly can kill them. So you have to wait until they're somewhat viable, but also not wait too long so you don't run the risk of the egg actually hatching as you're trying to sneak it through security, or which has happened. There are a couple of egg thieves. Landrum's not the only one doing this stuff, and it actually happened in the 1990s to an egg thief in the UK. 4 birds just began hatching and tweeting in his underwear. So he was busted. He was busted that way. And it happened to Landrum many years later. But anyway, so it's an art form. Not only do you have to find these birds in this vast wilderness area, and they are territorial, so they have huge areas. It's not like there are nests everywhere, I mean, the gerfalcon, all this stuff was new to me, but I just found myself getting, as you can tell, more and more caught up in the weirdness of it all. I mean, these birds establish their territory like 5 or 10 miles. So there may be a nest there, and then you're in your helicopter, and you have to sweep along another 5 miles, looking along the cliffs until you spot something, and then they would assess whether or not you could rappel down, land the helicopter on top of the cliff and rappel down, or whether it was so steep that Landrum would have to descend from a rope. And they spent basically about 10 days doing this. They captured something like 30 eggs, which is a significant part of the environmental bounty of this pristine part of the world. So pretty bad stuff, I think. I mean, it wasn't going to make the gerfalcon extinct, but, it's just nasty business. And Mullen, of course, was consumed by guilt about it, but, he did it anyway. And in fact, he did it the next year, too, which is then... So to make a long story short, again, sorry, or to condense this, because, I don't want to give too much of it away. Basically, Landrum continues on this incredible course, reckless, getting sort of more reckless, taking more chances. Eventually, it leads to this 2010 Birmingham airport incident where Andy McWilliams busts him. And because McWilliams kept him in prison without bail, he's able to dig up a lot of Landrum's history and proves that this is no ordinary bird egg collector, but somebody with global reach who's been doing it for years, who is a professional, making money, plundering the environment, probably with cronies in the Middle East. So he's working this, and there's a trial, a highly covered trial. It's just because the British media can't resist these elements of, ex-Rhodesian army guy, helicopters repelling Arab sheikhs, falcon eggs. So Landrum ends up getting, and forgive me for not knowing the details of my own book, but I think it's a 2.5 year prison sentence, which is the first time he's been doing this for 20 years already, and he's been caught a couple of times, but always managed to sneak out and get through with a fine. And it happened in Zimbabwe. It happened again in Quebec. He's always managed to sort of skate the thin ice and survive by paying off somebody, keeping his name sort of out of the papers. Thanks to MacWilliam, this guy's now all over the British press. His video of him dangling he's carrying the actual DVD in his carry-on luggage. MacWilliam grabs that. I mean, it's put up on YouTube. I mean, everything is out there now, and Landrum is in prison. So MacWilliam is kind of hoping that at this point, all right, the guy has it's time now. He's learned his lesson. Jail and exposure, media exposure. It's going to make him It's going to make it very difficult for him to continue along the lines, this life that he's led for 20, 25 years. Basically, so Landrum does get out of jail, and he does make this legitimate attempt to go straight. I think there are people who are family members, friends who are willing to help him. They find him work, normal life. He returns to South Africa, keeps a low profile, but something about those eggs. He just can't stop. I mean, it's just in his nature. So the next time we discover Landrum, he is arrested in Brazil. He has been stealing albino falcon eggs in Chilean Patagonia, in this place. This is Pali-Ike National Park, where I followed his trail down. This is in 2000. This is a harsh volcanic landscape with all of these dead volcanoes. Protected environment, and also an absolute haven for raptors, another weird, distant part of the world where raptors congregate, in which Landrum somehow or other discovered. This is part of the story that I don't know, how he found these volcanoes in the middle of nowhere, but and assessed that they were likely spots for these albino falcons. But the problem now is that Landrum is a very well-known character. His name is out there. He's more and more reckless. He draws a lot of suspicion about what he's up to, including letting the hotel clerks see his incubators and climbing equipment in his hotel room. So the hotel clerk, Googles his name, and the first thing he sees is this picture video of Landrum dangling from a rope in northern Quebec. He begins to read page after page of stories about this international wildlife thief, called by Andy McWilliams is quoted as a master thief on a global scale. The hotel clerk was like, "Whoa, what have we got here?" So a trap is laid, and Landrum is eventually captured in Brazil. He is sentenced to 4.5 years in prison in a Brazilian jail. Doesn't speak a word of Portuguese. Is facing a very difficult time. At that point, he escapes through the jungle to Argentina, and then back to South Africa, where I caught up with him in late 2017, where again, this was a long search to get a hold of Landrum. He had ducked me for many, many months, and I was intent on finding him and asking him, "Why are you doing this still? What's the Middle East connection? Explain to me your life." I had a lot of questions. He finally agreed to meet me in a shopping mall near Pretoria. and we hooked up there. And Lendrum again. I mean, it was a weird encounter. I found him to be a likable, charming character and a complete unrepentant liar. And it was kind of hard to have these two identities. Because I by this point knew so much about his life, and I could ask very specific, detailed questions, and yet he had an answer, just like he had an answer to those counterterrorism guys about the chiropractor and the duck eggs. He had answers. He was fast. If you didn't know anything about him, you would come away convinced that he was this victim. He was a true conservationist who'd been out to save these poor birds time and time again, and each time, by taking them from threatened positions or saving them from pigeon fanciers or from DDT or whatever. He had a story behind every heist. You'd come away thinking, well, maybe this guy really is this sort of victim, who's just had these terrible miscarriages of justice. But if you really knew his story, you realize he was just a masterful liar. So at the same time that you kind of find yourself liking him, you're also, you're kind of repulsed by this incredible pattern of mendacity. At any rate, okay, so my final words to Lendrum that day were, Jeff, are you going to go back to doing this? Because I found it was, if I didn't challenge him, but sort of played along and acknowledged, yes, you were doing this for the sake of the birds, but are you going to continue your crusade to save the birds, or are you out of this at this point? Because by this point, he had prostate cancer, a bad car accident in Johannesburg. He said he could barely lift his arms. He said the nerves in his neck were, he said, no, I'm gone. I'm out of this. I can't do this anymore. I'm too old, and I'm too tired, and I'm too sick. I'm not going to tell you what happens at that point. I leave Landrum. We shake hands. We go our separate ways. I will leave you with one final image. But I will not tell you exactly where that picture was taken or the circumstances behind it. Because I already feel like I've given away way too much of the story. But anyway, so I'm going to end the narrative there before I completely dissuade everybody from buying the book, since you've already heard. No, but there's a lot more, obviously. The book explores this whole crazy Arab obsession and the world of egg collectors and Andy McWilliams' life and naturalism and I try to do a lot of different things, in the manner of my one of the writers I admire most in the world, Susan Orlean. And I'm happy to say that a couple of reviews have made the Orchid Thief comparison. So, but this took me as far away from the world of sort of international terrorism and diplomacy and geopolitics that marked my last book to a certain extent. So I was kind of happy to just dive into what I thought was a great story, without any kind of larger geopolitical and environmental implications, but perhaps not geopolitical. On that note, I'm happy to open up the floor to the audience. And where are people's this? Please take that microphone if you have any questions. Anybody have a question or to ask me about this? Thank you.
I'm just curious. The Gerfalcon thievery happened in northern Canada, from what you said.
In this particular case,
particular falcon.
That's we know.
Did the Canadian authorities charge him?
The Canadian authorities. This
And
one
did
he got
he
away
get to
with.
be on
This is
Interpol?
This is 2001. That's when that picture. They managed to get away. The only way we know about that expedition is because the accomplice betrayed him and had the video show. They went back the next year and got caught this time. They were not very careful, raised suspicions. They were charged. They didn't have the evidence that they were actually trying to smuggle them out of the country, so they could only give him a fine. I told you, this guy skates thin ice. He got away with a fine and told Dick, don't ever set foot in Canada again. At that point, Paul Mullen, his accomplice, changed his name legally. I can't reveal his real name, but I was told I can call him by his old name since that name no longer exists. So yeah, they did what they could. They hit him with a $20,000 fine and then sent them on their way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just curious, how much would he get on average for each egg?
I didn't get into
haul?
that, the economics of that. So that's a really hard question. Because, for instance, it's been documented that some of these beautiful white gerfalcons, pure white ones, have been sold legally in the legal market for like $275,000. But with eggs, it's a little different because from what I understand, because eggs are, and I've talked to a couple of experts, including somebody who tried to place a value at his 2010 trial on the 14 eggs, because you don't know, you have to assume that maybe a third of them are not going to hatch, destroyed in transport or whatever. The female falcons are worth more than the male because the female falcons are bigger and better racers. And they pay more for them. So he placed a value on the 14 total of about $120,000 for all 14. But that was a calculation that a lot of people say was way too low. But still, that was like a month's work for Landrum, possibly more. But $120,000 is not bad for several days of climbing around the cliffs of Wales. And, of course, the preparation that is involved in finding those areas in the wilderness. Yeah.
So are these birds protected under CITES or the Migratory Bird Treaty Act?
Yeah, it's CITES.
CITES,
Yes, it's CITES. There
You
may
know
be,
if they're-
there's a lot of overlapping legislation that was always extremely confusing for me. I didn't want to get too bogged down because I didn't even understand it. The Brits and the European Union have all these laws, and then overlaid on that is CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So these are all considered, I think they call them Article 1 or Index 1 birds.
Yeah,
which,
Appendix 1 or
Appendix 1.
Appendix
Appendix
2?
1, correct. These
They're
are all
Appendix
Appendix 1s, which
Okay.
means, as I said, you can't trade them, you can't market them, you can't have them. The wild ones I'm talking about, unless you have a license as a scientist to study them, and that's really rare to get. So,
Okay.
yeah. Anyone else? Deborah.
You only have the one face-to-face with
Just one, but we did speak on the phone over the course of 6 months. Yeah.
When is this going to be a movie?
That's a good question. It's in development.
All right.
I don't have anything
Good
to
to
do
hear.
with it. I don't sit around waiting, Been in the business too long. Bob.
So if he had these eggs wrapped around him, I assume this picture is sort of that. Does that not show up when he goes through security? How do you smuggle eggs on an airplane?
So some of the aspects of this were he would go through metal detectors, and metal detectors did often he had them obscured enough so that they would not show up. But this picture was taken as he was coming into Heathrow Airport, so he had already gotten through Johannesburg Airport with these around, presumably kept strapped to his stomach. But for various reasons, as he said, he's a guy who got more and more reckless as this career dragged on, and just kept making more and more stupid mistakes and was busted. Donatella.
Going back to the transportation of these eggs, he wasn't taking economy class at Joburg to London with those eggs on him,
I
was he?
think he had enough miles accumulated that he generally went business class. Yeah.
It was just because they
He
weren't
went
in his
business.
back, but
he
he
was on the
basically
Emirates. Remember he was on the Emirates business class lounge in 2010 when he was busted. So yeah, they usually he and Mullen traveled business class a lot. Once Mullen's first introduction to his clandestine life was when Landrum tried to bring two live lanner falcons, 2-day-old lanner falcons. This was, I think, before he really moved into the egg business. Stuffed in his pockets and then placed in a backpack and put in the carry-on of a Virgin Atlantic flight.
were they alive? At the
They
end?
were alive, and they began screeching. Every couple of hours, they would wake and screech, and he would have to run and take them into the toilet and feed them his little liver and egg yolk mix, get them back to sleep, put them back on top. This was Mullen's first realization that he was dealing with a very, crazy person. So, yes.
Yes, can you tell us about the psychology of this gentleman? I mean,
That's a good question.
Why is he doing it?
Very good question.
There must be an obsession there.
Yeah, of course
It's
there is. I
not,
think
not
he's
only
wild.
money. So that's my first question. The second one is just as interesting. I mean, can you tell us about your psychology? I mean, why?
Why
Yeah,
spend 2.5 years of my life?
there is
doing this story?
there is a
Is that what you're
fascination
asking?
in this.
It's all about obsession, man.
Did you ever dream in the past few years of stealing eggs yourself and going to Dubai?
Okay.
So there is something there.
All right, so about Landrum, I mean, look, this is a guy who obviously his father was a bit ethically challenged since his father was arrested led him, I mean, not everybody in the Landrum family became criminals. His brother and sister are perfectly normal, conventional people to some extent. But Landrum's obviously was closest to the father. The two had very similar interests. They stole together. They researched eggs together. They stole together. This appears to have been Landrum's métier from an early age. People who knew him growing up said he was always pushing the envelope. He was always challenging authority, wanted to be different, was doing it, loved the sort of physical thrill of going after these birds and birds' nests. Going back to the time he was 11, 12 years old, he was doing this sort of thing, stealing eggs out of nests. It was a weird compulsion that you find often with these wildlife criminals. For instance, these egg thieves that MacWilliam spent several years busting, these people who collect these eggs passionately, hundreds, thousands, literally thousands of eggs, stash them in their attic and go up and, just to gaze at them. And, this is a crazy obsession that Landrum, I think, suffered from, but there was also, of course, because those egg collectors also, they do the same thing. They love the danger. They love the challenge of the climb. I mean, you talk to some of these people, the physical risk, the defiance of authority. They know it's illegal. They get just a total charge out of it. And so there was a lot of similarity between Landrum and these egg collectors, but Landrum took it to another level in that he had, through connections that you will read about when you buy the book, you will find out how he made that Arab connection. And so it just happened to be kind of in the right place at the right time in that way, and was led into doing this for commercial reasons. Although as I think I said, there's no indication that he really ever got rich from this. The New York Times review said, meet the Pablo Escobar of the illegal egg trade or something like that. That Pablo Escobar title he conferred upon himself to me, ironically, saying, the first time I talked to him, he sort of, angrily said, everybody wants to make me out to be the Pablo Escobar of the egg trade. It's it's bollocks, it's crap. And I think that I published that in the Outside magazine piece about it, and the British press picked it up, and suddenly he was always the Pablo Escobar of the illegal egg trade. Even though it was said in complete sarcasm, it became the epithet that became known as. So about me, why this story are you asking about, or do you want a general psychological portrait? I don't know. Because I think I've been a foreign correspondent for a lot of years, and then my career kind of morphed a little bit, and I became just really interested in narrative, long form narrative nonfiction. I just like to find stories, and that led me to the Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu, which was just a good yarn, But and so I became sort of less. I wanted to tell us. I think what worked about the Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu is it had a hero, and it had sort of anti-hero was sort of a morality play set in a very strange part of the world, exotic, could allow me to flex my writing muscles, develop characters. That's what I wanted to do with the next book, and this story somehow resonated. Is obviously a completely different story from the Bad-Ass Librarians of Timbuktu, but it had a lot of elements. It had a great, potentially great central character, as long as I could balance him with a good guy, because I don't think you would want to just read 270 pages about a villain. And so I was fortunate enough to have what I thought was just a very appealing police officer who had this weird fixation on bird crime, to balance out. Although a couple of people have told me that they actually like Landrum more and found MacWilliam to be just basically an administrative geek, but that seems to be a rare view. I mean, people do seem to like the balance of characters. So I don't know. This story just seemed to have all the elements that I like to do in a story. I like writing. I like telling stories in book form, and I also like kind of penetrating subcultures and worlds that I don't know anything about, and I really knew next to nothing about falconry or eggs or I mean, I loved birds, but not in any sort of Jonathan Franzen passionate, bird obsessive gazing way. I mean, I did appreciate that, and this experience made me more appreciative of. I wouldn't call myself particularly a birder, but I do appreciate and love them more than I did previously. So it just, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I also love environmental stuff. I'm a contributing writer to Outside Magazine. I've always loved, and this struck me as having the opportunity to, if you follow this trail of this criminal, think of all the amazing places you would go. I used to cover war zones, but now I don't want to go to war zones anymore. But going to the volcanic desert of Patagonia, or Matobo National Park in Zimbabwe to look at raptors. I mean, that was an adventure, So for all of these reasons, it spoke to me in a way that all the other ideas I had before falling on this one did not. Anyone else? Yeah, Kathleen, can you step up to the mic? Sorry. C-SPAN is here. I didn't even introduce these guys. This is why we're doing this. Yes. Forgot about that. Yeah.
This relates really to an earlier question, but do you think in the course of the pretrial proceedings that anyone did a psychiatric evaluation of Landrum?
Not that I'm aware of, but you don't get really a lot out of these British cops. It's really hard to get them to tell you anything. This case, fortunately, was over and done with, so MacWilliam could give me some stuff. But it was hard. I tried to get a hold of, interrogation tapes, transcripts, I filed the Freedom of Information Act request. And it was all, they told me everything, they denied it. They said everything was destroyed. We had to keep it for 5 years and destroy everything. So I got very little. I wanted to get the counterterrorism story. They wouldn't talk to me. So what went on with psychology? It may be that he got a psychological evaluation, but just another one of those mysteries, Yeah. Mitch? Yeah, we'll make this the last. Sorry, guys. Yeah, Mitch.
Thanks, Josh. This is fascinating. Given how lucrative this was, are there other Lendrums out there? How extensive is the scheme?
Yeah,
Do you
well,
have a sense?
I don't think it was, as I said, I don't think it was all that lucrative for Landrum. He didn't seem to be after it really for that. He didn't live a particularly extravagant lifestyle, and he seemed to be more interested in it for the thrill. But yeah, I mean, I did some research into this. It's such a clandestine world, and you can't get anything out of the Arabs, the sheikhs. It's really even taboo for most people, even the breeders. They know about it, they won't talk about it. But there appear to be some, I mean, they busted occasional trappers up in the wilderness of Siberia or Peshawar, Pakistan. There was a TV documentary in the UK in the 90s that sort of laid a trap where a guy actually posed as the producer or the host of the show posed as an Arab sheikh and lured out a couple of these middlemen and egg collectors. So we know this world exists, but it's never been as clearly, outlined and tangible as it's been in the case of Jeffrey Lendrum. So I think we're out of time, but yeah. This is nonfiction. I'm glad you. It reads like fiction. What? Not in the least. Not in the least. No. I've tried to be as faithful as I can to the truth. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. What a fascinating world he's.